The morning of the interview, the studio was buzzing with a kind of electricity that only happens once in a blue moon. People who'd worked there for 20 years were adjusting their ties or fiddling with their hair, which they never did. The usual chaos of a live show was still their cables snaking across the floor. A producer yelling about a missing coffee order. The audience wrangler trying to get a group of excited tourists to settle down. But underneath it all was a deep, thrumming sense of occasion. They all knew why. Two legends were in the building. It had taken months of back and forth, countless phone calls between powerful agents and even more powerful assistants to make this happen. The idea was simple on paper. Get Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro to share a couch for a segment on The View, to talk about a new fund for retired actors, especially the old stuntmen and character actors who sometimes fell through the cracks. A noble cause, something they could both agree on without too much fuss. Getting them to agree to show up, though, was like arranging a diplomatic summit between two countries that had a long, quiet history of not getting along. They arrived within minutes of each other, but from opposite ends of the universe. Eastwood came in first. He moved slowly, but not in a way that felt frail. It was more like a glacier moves, deliberate, steady, and with an immense, quiet power. He was tall, so tall he seemed to make the ceiling feel lower. He wore a simple navy blazer over a colored shirt, and his famous squint was in full effect as he took in the fluorescent-lit hallway. He didn't say much, just a nod here, a quiet morning there. His assistant, a woman who'd been with him for decades, spoke in hushed tones with the producer, mapping out the quickest path to the green room. He followed, a calm island in the storm. The green room was set up with plush sofas and a spread of fruit, pastries, and coffee. Eastwood ignored the sofa. He walked over to the coffee urn, poured himself a cup black, and stood by the window looking out at the New York streets below. He didn't check his phone. He didn't fidget. He just stood there, sipping his coffee, completely contained. When a young production assistant nervously approached to ask if he needed anything, he offered a small, almost imperceptible smile and shook his head. "I'm fine, thank you," he said, his voice a soft rasp. The assistant scurried away, feeling both dismissed and strangely honored that the energy shifted when De Niro arrived. You heard him before you saw him, a low, rumbling conversation, the sound of several people moving together. He entered the green room with a small entourage, his brow furrowed as he listened to his publicist remind him of the talking points. He was dressed sharper, a tailored jacket, his expression one of intense focus. He acknowledged the room with a quick glance, his eyes missing nothing. They landed on Eastwood's back by the window. A beat of silence passed. "Clint," De Niro said, not a question, a statement. Eastwood turned from the window. The two men's eyes met across the room. There was no animosity in that first look, but no warmth either. It was the look of two generals who have studied each other's battle plans for years, finally meeting in neutral territory. They knew each other, of course. They'd crossed paths at award shows, at fundraisers, in the rarefied air of Hollywood's highest peak for over half a century. But they'd never worked together. They'd never really had a reason to sit and talk. "Bob," Eastwood replied with a slight nod. That was it. No handshake. No move to close the distance. De Niro gave a short nod back and turned his attention to the food table, picking up a strawberry and examining it. His energy was kinetic, buzzing. He was preparing. Eastwood's energy was potential, a coiled spring. He was waiting. A senior producer bustled in, her headset crackling. "Gentlemen, we're so honored to have you both. We'll be going out in about 15. The segment is slated for 20 minutes. We'll start with some reminiscing, your careers, then pivot to the charity fund for the veterans of the industry. Whoopi will lead, but the other hosts will jump in. Sound good?" De Niro looked up. The veterans, yeah. That's the important part. He said it like he was making sure the producer understood her own show. That's the heart of it. Eastwood agreed quietly from his spot by the window. The producer smiled, a little nervously. Great. Perfect. We'll have someone come get you when we're ready. The door closed, leaving the two men and their people in the room. The assistants and publicists made small talk with each other, a buffer zone of polite chatter between the two silent titans. De Niro sat on the edge of a sofa, going over his notes again, his lips moving slightly as he rehearsed a point. He was a man who famously prepared, who burrowed into a role. Today, his role was Robert De Niro, concerned icon. Eastwood finally left his post by the window. He didn't sit, but he walked over and took a chair opposite De Niro, setting his empty coffee cup down. He watched De Niro prepare, his face unreadable. After a moment, De Niro felt the gaze and looked up. "You ready for this?" he asked. It wasn't a challenge, just a question from one professional to another. "I'm always ready," Eastwood said. And that was that dot when the runner came to escort them to the set. They stood. They didn't speak as they were led down the narrow, busy hallway. The sound of the live audience filtered through the walls, a dull, excited roar. As they waited in the wings, just out of sight, the stage manager whispered last-minute instructions. They both ignored her, their attention on the curtain. On the other side, Whoopi Goldberg was introducing them. For decades, these two men had defined what it means to be a towering figure in American cinema. Please welcome, together for the first time on our stage, the legendary Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro. The roar of the audience swelled to a deafening level. The stage manager pointed. "Go, go." And they walked out. Eastwood first, with that long, loping stride into the blinding stage lights. De Niro right behind him, a step to the side. The audience was on its feet, cheering, whistling, the sound wave of pure adulation hitting them physically. They both offered small, tight smiles and waves. Eastwood's a humble hand raise, De Niro's a quicker, two-fingered salute. They settled into the two chairs reserved for them on the famous couch. For a moment, as the applause finally began to die down, they looked at each other. Not at the hosts, not at the audience. At each other. A flicker of something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the sheer weirdness of this moment. Two lions in winter, surrounded by this cheerful daytime television set. Then they turned, almost in unison, to face Whoopi, their polite, professional smiles back in place. The camera zoomed in. The red on-air light glowed, and the clock started ticking. The initial applause settled into a warm, expectant hum. The studio lights, which felt like standing in the sun, made the set seem both huge and intimate. Whoopi Goldberg, seated between her co-hosts, gave a wide, genuine smile. This was her house, and she was a master at making guests feel at ease, even guests who seemed carved from granite and old leather. "So," she began, her voice a comfortable, familiar rasp. "Let's start with an easy one. You've both been making movies longer than some of our viewers have been alive. What's the one thing you miss the most about the old way of doing things? The craft of it." She looked to Eastwood first. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his long fingers steepled together. He took a beat, a silence he owned completely, before breaking it. "The quiet," he said, his voice a low, dry rustle. Not literal quiet, though there was more of that too. The quiet to figure it out. A shot wasn't right. You'd sit. Think. Talk it through with the cameraman, the actor. No one was screaming about a schedule or a budget report on a phone. It was deliberate. He said the word like it was the most important thing in the world. Deliberate. De Niro was nodding almost before Eastwood finished, a quick, energetic bounce of his head. Yes, yes. The focus. It was about the work in the room right then. Now. He spread his hands, a gesture taking in the invisible world beyond the bright lights. There's a noise, a million opinions before you've even shot a frame. From people who... He trailed off, choosing his words carefully. From people whose first concern isn't the story. One of the other hosts, younger, leaned in. Do you mean the studios? Or like the internet? The critics? De Niro glanced at her, then back to Whoopi. It's a system. The money people. They see a spreadsheet, not a scene. They want a thing that fits a formula. The mid-budget picture, the character-driven piece, where an actor my age or Clint's age could carry a film just by. He tapped his chest. By the life in his face. That's a hard sell now. Eastwood gave a small, almost imperceptible grunt. It wasn't agreement or disagreement. It was an acknowledgement of a fact. Audiences changed, he stated. Simple as that. You give people what they want, or you don't work. Sentiment doesn't fill seats, Bob. It was the first time he'd used his name on television. It landed with a subtle weight. Not friendly, not unfriendly. A statement of fact between two men who knew the score. De Niro's eyes flicked to him. It's not sentiment. It's substance. It's about telling human stories, not just spectacles. People find substance in spectacles, Eastwood countered, his tone still even, but a thread of something firmer weaving through it. A cowboy alone on a plain, that's a spectacle. And its substance. The box doesn't matter. It's what you put inside it. The exchange was still civil, but the temperature in the studio had ticked up a degree. The audience was dead quiet, leaning forward. This wasn't rehearsed banter. This was real. Whoopi, sensing the first hint of a divergence, smoothly steered the ship. Well, you've both put incredible things in that box. Let's talk about the reason you're both here today. This fund for veteran actors, for the stuntmen, the character actors, the people who built this industry with you, but might not have the safety net. It was the perfect pivot. Both men straightened in their chairs, focusing on the shared purpose. De Niro jumped in, his passion immediate. These are the artists, the ones who make it real. You see a face in a crowd scene, a guy taking a punch, a woman waiting tables in the background. That's a life. That's a craft. And when the work dries up, which it does, what then? We have a responsibility. Eastwood was nodding now, a slow, definite motion. He's right. I've worked with hundreds of them. Men who showed me how to fall off a horse when I was young. Women who could cry on cue in a 2-second shot. They're the foundation. The fund isn't a handout. It's a thank you, a recognition of service to the craft. For a beautiful few minutes, they were in sync. They spoke about specific people. A grizzled prop master Eastwood had worked with on 3 pictures. A dialect coach De Niro swore by. They finished each other's sentences about the importance of pensions, of health care. The audience was nodding along, touched. The co-host smiled, relieved. This was the segment they'd hoped for. 2 icons, united for a good cause. Then, the younger host saw an opportunity. It's so beautiful to see this unity. And it makes me think that kind of loyalty, that kind of code, it feels like it comes from a different America. A less divided one. Do you ever feel like you're relics of that time? And does that make this mission even more urgent? It was an innocent question, but it was a match held near a very long, very dry fuse. De Niro took a deep breath, his earlier fire returning. It's more than divided. It's being poisoned. The divide is one thing, but the poison comes from the top, from certain political forces who have no respect for truth, for art, for anything but power. They hate what we do. They call it elitist to tell a human story. That's the noise I was talking about. That's what's killing the mid-budget drama culture that celebrates ignorance. His voice had risen. He wasn't shouting, but he was filling the space, jabbing a finger into his own palm for emphasis. The studio was utterly still. Eastwood had gone very still beside him. His jaw was set. He stared straight ahead, not at the Niro, not at the host, at some point in the middle distance. The friendly old soldier posture was gone. He looked like a man listening to a bugle play the wrong tune. Whoopi tried. Well, that's a lot to, but Eastwood's voice cut through, quiet and sharp as a whip crack. This isn't the place for a stump speech, Robert. The use of the full name this time was a cold shower. It wasn't Bob. It was Robert. Distant, formal. A correction. De Niro turned his whole body to face him, the movement quick. It's everywhere, Clint. Silence is complicity. You, of all people, the man who made a career out of speaking without words. You should know that. The air was gone from the room. The audience didn't breathe. A producer off stage put a hand over her headset, her eyes wide. This wasn't in the rundown. Eastwood slowly turned his head. He looked directly at De Niro, and the full force of that pale blue stare, the one that had made bad guys at 100 movies rethink their life choices, was now fixed on his fellow legend. It wasn't anger yet. It was a profound, deep disappointment. A judgment. We, Eastwood said, each word a stone placed carefully on a scale, are here. For them, not for you to score points off the news cycle. You're hijacking the purpose. The two men, side by side on the floral couch, were now a continent apart. The charity, the veterans, the fond reminiscing, all of it was gone, vaporized in the heat of a clash that had been 50 years in the making. The clock on the live broadcast kept ticking, and there were still 12 minutes left. The silence that followed Eastwood's words was the loudest sound the studio had ever heard. It wasn't an empty silence. It was thick, heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. The audience sat frozen. A woman in the third row had her hand halfway to her mouth, as if she'd been about to gasp, but forgot to finish. The co-hosts looked at each other, then at Whoopi, their eyes screaming a silent question. Asterisk, what do we do? Asterisk. Whoopi Goldberg, a veteran of live television chaos, opened her mouth to speak, to wrestle back control. But she was a fraction of a second too slow. De Niro leaned forward, his body tense. The friendly, passionate artist was gone. In his place was the intensity of Jake LaMotta, of Travis Bickle, a man who'd hit a raw nerve and wouldn't back down. Hijacking? De Niro's voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the room. You call telling the truth hijacking? That's the problem. That's the whole damn problem. We sit around talking about the good old days and a charity fund, which is important. Yeah, but we ignore the elephants stomping on the whole room. The art we're talking about saving doesn't exist in a bubble. It's being suffocated by lies, by a cult of personality that treats decency and facts as weaknesses. He was no longer addressing Eastwood directly, but speaking to the room, to the cameras, using Eastwood as a symbol of the silence he despised. You want to talk about veterans of film? What about the veterans of truth? Where's their fund? Eastwood didn't move. He simply listened, his face like a cliff face weathering a storm. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes, grew colder. This was no longer a disagreement about film or charity. This was a fundamental clash of how to move through the world. When De Niro paused, drawing breath, Eastwood spoke. His voice hadn't risen. If anything, it had grown quieter, which made everyone strain to hear. It was the voice of a director on a set who had finally lost patience. You're ranting, Eastwood said, the word flat and final. You're using a room full of people who came to hear about helping others as a stage for your own political theatrics. It's disrespectful. To them? He gave a slight nod toward the audience. And to the people we're supposed to be here for. Theatrics? De Niro shot back, his composure cracking into genuine anger. Calling out a danger to the country is theatrics? What do you call it, Clint? Pragmatism? Letting it all burn because it's not polite to mention the fire? One of the younger co-hosts, seeing her chance to mediate, jumped in, her voice too bright, too cheerful for the moment. I think what we're seeing is a generational difference in activism, right? Mr. De Niro, you're coming from a place of passionate public engagement, and Mr. Eastwood, you're coming from a more private, traditional stance. Both are valid. It was the worst possible thing to say. Both men turned their heads toward her, and the combined force of their annoyance was so potent she physically shrank back in her seat. This isn't about generations, De Niro said. Dismissing her completely, his focus locked back on Eastwood. It's about courage. It was always about courage. The guys we played had it. You think the man with no name would see what's happening and just ride on? It was a direct hit, a move to pull Eastwood's own mythic image into the fight. The audience let out a collective ooh. For the first time, Eastwood's expression shifted. A flicker of something impatience, maybe even contempt, crossed his face. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, placing his large, weathered hands on his knees. The movement was slow, controlled, and it commanded absolute attention. Don't, he said, the word a warning shot. Don't you dare confuse a character I played 50 years ago with what's happening in this room. That's a fantasy. This is real life. And in real life, shouting isn't courage. It's just noise. You think you're the only one who sees problems? You think you have a monopoly on concern? He was building now, the quiet force of his words beginning to roll over De Niro's fiery outbursts. You talk about a cult of personality. Look in the mirror, Robert. You've built a brand on this. The angry artist. It's a costume. And you're wearing it right now, performing for these good people, instead of doing the job you agreed to do. De Niro's face flushed. A costume? You're calling my conscience a costume? That's disgraceful. You stand for nothing but your own stubborn silence. I stand for the men and women who can't pay their medical bills. Eastwood's voice finally rose, not to a shout, but to a powerful, resonant boom that echoed in the small studio. It was the voice of Dirty Harry, telling a punk he'd run out of chances. I stand for the purpose of this meeting. You dragged your politics in here like a dead skunk and dropped it on the table. And now you're surprised the dinner is ruined. That's not conscience. That's selfishness. The argument had completely left the rails. The charity was forgotten. Film was forgotten. It was now a bare-knuckled, personal confrontation between two titanic wills. De Niro was fueled by a hot, righteous fury. Eastwood was driven by a cold, profound fury at the violation of what he saw as a simple agreement, a basic code. De Niro shook his head, a sarcastic, disbelieving smile on his lips. Unbelievable. The great Clint Eastwood. The American icon. All you care about is order. A neat little conversation. Well, the world isn't a movie set, Clint. You can't just call cut on the things that make you uncomfortable. Eastwood looked at him for a long, long second. He looked at the furious man beside him, at the stunned hosts, at the audience of wide-eyed strangers. He saw the whole segment, the entire noble purpose, lying in ruins at his feet. And in that moment, the director in him, the man who controlled chaos, who made swift, final decisions to save the project, took over from the actor. From the guest, his expression cleared of all anger. It became calm, detached, and utterly decisive. He turned his head slowly toward Whoopi Goldberg, who was watching him, her own professional calm finally broken into plain shock. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke clearly, calmly, and with an authority that brooked no argument. It was a statement, not a request. He's done. This is over. He paused, then pointed a single steady finger directly at Robert De Niro, who was still mid-breath, ready to fire back another salvo. Get him off. The 3 words hung in the air. For a heartbeat, no one moved. No one even seemed to understand. Get him off? Off the couch? Off the stage? It was impossible. This was live television. This was Robert De Niro. But Clint Eastwood had spoken. And when Clint Eastwood spoke in that tone, people had been listening and obeying for 70 years. The impossible silence stretched for 1 more second before the studio exploded into a chaos of gasps, murmurs, and the frantic, muffled shouts of a director screaming into headsets off stage. The gasp from the audience was like one organism sucking in all the air in the room. It was followed by a stunned, buzzing murmur. For a few seconds, the machinery of the show ground to a complete halt. The cameras, operated by professionals who'd seen everything, stayed locked on the 2 men. The one on Eastwood showed his profile, calm and hard as stone. The one on De Niro caught the exact moment his furious expression dissolved into pure, unvarnished shock. His eyebrows shot up. His mouth, which had been a tight line of argument, went slack. He blinked as if trying to clear a mirage. He turned his whole body in the plush chair to face Eastwood, the material of his jacket rustling loudly in the dead-quiet studio. "What did you say?" Eastwood didn't look at him. He kept his gaze fixed forward, on the confused face of the producer, who was now visible just off stage, waving her arms in a silent panic. He had issued his directive. The rest was not his concern. Whoopi Goldberg found her voice first. It was the voice she used to quiet a rowdy audience, strong and centered. "Okay, gentlemen. Let's everyone take a breath here. We're all a little heated. This is an important discussion, and sometimes passion. This isn't a discussion." Eastwood interrupted, still not raising his voice. He finally turned his head, and his look to Whoopi wasn't angry. It was almost apologetic, but firm. Like a captain telling a passenger the lifeboats were being deployed. "It's a spectacle. And I didn't come here for a spectacle. He's finished." He gestured again, a small, dismissive flick of his hand toward De Niro. The word "finished" seemed to break the spell of disbelief for De Niro. The shock burned away, reigniting into a hotter, more personal anger. His face flushed a deep red. "You don't get to decide when I'm finished," he said, his voice trembling with the effort to control it. "Who the hell do you think you are? This is a television show. You're a guest, same as me. And you're a bully on a soapbox," Eastwood said, the words coming out flat and cold. "And I'm done listening to it." The directness of it, the sheer, unadorned insult, landed like a physical blow. De Niro shoved himself up from the couch, not in a slow rise, but in one jerky, furious motion. He stood over Eastwood, who remained seated. The image was jarring one man, standing in towering rage, the other sitting in glacial calm. "You smug son of a bitch," De Niro breathed, the microphone picking it up and sending it across the airwaves in a sibilant whisper. That did it. Eastwood moved. It wasn't a fast move. At his age, nothing was fast. But it was decisive. He placed his hands on the arms of his chair and pushed himself up. It was a tall, unfolding rise, a man revealing his full height. As he stood, he seemed to reclaim the space around him. He didn't get in De Niro's face. He didn't have to. He simply stood to his full height, looking down slightly at the other man, his presence expanding to fill the stage. He wasn't threatening him. He was making him an obstacle that needed to be removed from his field of view. He didn't say another word to De Niro, he looked past him. To the side of the stage where a young, burly stage manager in a black headset had appeared, looking like a man who'd been pushed in front of a moving train. "Son," Eastwood said to him, his tone shifting to one of clear, direct command, the tone of a director to a grip. "See that Mr. De Niro finds his way off the set. Now." The stage manager froze, eyes wide. "This wasn't in the manual. You didn't lay hands on Robert De Niro. You didn't eject him." De Niro let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. He looked at the stunned hosts, at the paralyzed stage manager, and finally back at Eastwood. "You're unbelievable. You are truly, truly unbelievable." The words were spat out, each one dripping with contempt. He knew then that he couldn't stay. To remain would be to submit to Eastwood's authority, to play out this insane scene of being escorted off. The only power he had left was to leave on his own terms. With a swift, violent motion, he grabbed the small microphone clipped to his jacket lapel. There was a horrible tearing sound as he ripped it free, the wire snapping from its pack. He didn't drop it. He threw it. It wasn't aimed at anyone, just a gesture of pure, final disgust. The little black unit hit the carpeted stage with a dull thud and skittered under the coffee table. He turned, his back to Eastwood, to the hosts, to the cameras. For a second, he seemed to scan the audience, taking in the hundreds of stunned, silent faces. It looked less like a farewell, and more like he was memorizing witnesses to an injustice. Then he strode off. Not a storming, theatrical exit, but a quick, stiff-legged walk, his shoulders hunched forward as if against a strong wind. He disappeared into the dark wing from which they had entered, followed a second later by the terrified stage manager, who was probably just hoping the legend wouldn't get lost in the hallway. Eastwood watched him go. Then, slowly, he sat back down. He adjusted his jacket. He let out a long, slow breath that was picked up by his own still-live microphone. The entire exchange, from his standing up to De Niro's exit, had taken less than 30 seconds. It felt like an hour. The studio was a tomb. The audience was afraid to clap, afraid to cough, afraid to move. One of the co-hosts had tears in her eyes, though whether from shock, fear, or frustration was unclear. Whoopi Goldberg sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of professional composure that was visibly cracking at the edges. She was looking at Eastwood, who was now staring straight ahead again, as if waiting for a bus stop off stage. The director finally broke through his own paralysis. A frantic voice yelled into headsets, "Go to break. Go to break now. Music. Roll something." The cheerful, generic theme music for The View suddenly blared through the studio speakers, shockingly loud and horribly out of place. The bright, animated logo splashed across the monitors. The red on air light flicked off. The spell broke. The audience erupted into a roar of confused conversation. People were turning to each other, mouths agape, hands flying up in, can you believe it? Gestures. On stage, the co-hosts all started talking at once in hushed, frantic tones to Whoopi, who just shook her head slowly. Through it all, Clint Eastwood sat perfectly still. He didn't look at the chaos around him. He didn't look at the hosts. He looked at the empty space on the couch beside him, where, just minutes before, Robert De Niro had been sitting. His face showed no victory, no remorse. It showed the quiet, weary satisfaction of a man who had just cleaned up a mess, even if the method had been to break the thing that made it.